God's thoughts. It motivates you to actually be intentional to do things. So I was intentional on Friday to witness to my resident doctor who will be finishing in July. And I asked him what he believes about what happens to him when he dies, what happens to your body, soul, and spirit. And he says, that's it, there's nothing. And then I said, how does your answer differ from your parents and grandparents? Is it very similar or very different? He said, well, I'm Jewish and it's very different than my parents and grandparents. And as my upbringing, it had to do with the law and following the law. So he is 80% of all people 20 years old that are in the medical field that I have asked that question to. They are drastically different than their parents, whether they're Hindus, Muslims, Jews, or Christians. On the other hand, when I witnessed to my two fellows, it means they're 5 years out of med school and they're going to be infectious doctors. I asked them the question, they said, because I trusted Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior, and he died for me, paid for my sins, so I'm going to heaven. So you get those sort of words of encouragement that there's hope out there for the next generation. But if you don't ask, you'll never know. And then you always ask permission because I have authority over this person, so I can't coerce them. But if you do it in a way that doesn't coerce them, you can actually keep your job and not get fired and share the word and be viewed as someone who's really looking out for other people. Now, not that I'm a great model to look for, because don't look at me, you'll see a lot of flaws and problems. But that's my motivation, and I try to tell others the same. So with that in mind, excuse me, today, when you leave today, the idea is, what did you take home with you? And the answer is, what is compassion? That is the answer. As far as my scale of 1 to 10 being quite compassionate, I would give myself a 6. And that's probably really giving myself too much, because that's not my nature. Some people are just naturally compassionate, okay? Compassionate if you're a doctor, right? But it's hard to, mold this thing up in you. So what is compassion? If you had to come up with a definition, it's about showing kindness and consideration to help others, especially when they're upset. It's about having genuine feelings of other people's struggles. How involved in other people's struggles are you? You get involved with them, you sympathize with them. This one is interesting because it brings out synonyms, words, compassion, empathy, I hear you, connection, hearing, empathy, present. I take time, I listen to you. How about this one? If you pity someone, I feel sorry for you. If I sympathize with someone, sympathy card, send them all the time, I feel for you. Empathy, that's a little stronger bond. I feel with you, I have gone through a road similar to you, and I can empathize with you because I know what you're feeling, because I felt the same thing. And then compassion is actually action. I'm here to help you, what can I do, right? So these are different levels. How about this? What is the opposite of empathy? It's extremely critical of others. That's the opposite. Feeling like others are too sensitive all the time. Not listening to them and their perspectives, opinions. Unable to cope with emotional situations, so I just avoid people. Confused about the feeling of others and victim blaming. So with that in mind, who's the ultimate embodiment of compassion? Jesus Christ, right? So he does the Sermon on the Mount, which we covered in Luke chapter 6. And I'm going to take you through a whirlwind reminder of what we covered. Most important verse we spent time on was, he said something totally shocking to that society, and even to our society. We have a problem with this. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you, persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, Matthew 5:44 and 45. So that concept is totally foreign to the average person, right? And why is that? It's because the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God. They are foolishness unto him, neither can he know them because they are spiritually discerned. Now, a lost person can show compassion, but they can't do it to the level of a Christian because God and the Holy Spirit is the author of compassion. So you don't confuse compassion and what you see people do it, and many Christians aren't very compassionate. Here's another one. Jesus, speaking to the crowd, again, we covered this last time, said unto them, if God were your father, you would love me, because I proceed forth and came from God. Neither did I come myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? It's because you can't hear my word. Okay, that is the whole point. The communication is not getting through because the heart has no life in it. It's like speaking to a corpse. It's going nowhere. And then we talked about who is my neighbor. The Jewish idea is a neighbor is anybody who's Jewish and is an elite follower of your faith. Jesus says, well, here's a neighbor. I'll give you an example. The person you hate the most is the Samaritan. He's the one that's your neighbor. That was shocking example to them, right? And then we talked about what are the imprecatory psalms. How can the Bible say, dear Lord, sack those group of people because they're bugging me and harassing me? Is that allowed in the Bible? Well, apparently, if you look at the Psalms, people crying out to God, thanksgiving, lament, royal psalms, wisdom psalms, imprecatory psalms, messianic psalms, psalms that point to the Messiah. And what is an imprecatory psalm? It communicates a deep yearning for justice written from the point of view of those who have been mightily oppressed. God's people have the promise of divine vengeance. Will not God bring about justice for his chosen one who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and they get it quickly. Only a perfect God can mete out justice in that regards, as opposed to us who are fallen. Vengeance is mine and recompense. Their foot shall slip in due time. For the day of their calamity is coming. The things to come hastens upon them. That's an imprecatory verse. Beloved, do not avenge yourself, but rather give place of wrath. It is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. That's the opposite. This is our version of it. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. He makes his sun rise on evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. And the ultimate example of that sacrificial mercy, despite total mistreatment, was Jesus on the cross saying, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. That is not a human thing to do. Neither did Stephen when he knelt down and cried out as he was being stoned, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. That's not natural. And then what does the verse say we should do? Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children. Walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us, gave himself up for us as fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. So God is trying to smell your sacrifices and offerings, just like he did with his son. He was well pleased. And then we concluded Christians are known by three things. How they hate sin, mostly in themselves as opposed to others. How they love others, and how they look forward to Jesus coming to rule the world with justice and righteousness. So now we get into chapter 7. And Jesus heals a centurion's servant from a distance, shows power from a distance. We're now going to talk about Jesus raising the son of the widow of Nain, power over death. Then we're going to talk about John the Baptist sends messengers to Jesus and says, tell John I'm doing all these things to heal the sick, the poor, and cast out demons. So he has power over sickness and death, disease. And a sinful woman comes to Jesus at Simon's house and Jesus forgives her of her sins and the power over sin. So last time we did the centurion who came to Jesus, and we asked the question, what amazes Jesus? God incarnate, what amazes him? And right after the Sermon on the Mount, we get this example of this centurion who actually is the fulfillment of the sermon. And what was the key verse? He says, when Jesus heard this, that is the centurion saying, I am a person over other people. If I say do this, they do it. I don't have to think about it. You, as God, can say do this, and you can heal my servant. So I'm going to be humble. Don't come to my house and defile yourself. Just say the word and I'll believe that'll happen. That's what my life is like. Jesus goes, I say to you, not even in Israel have I seen such great faith, a shocking indictment of the people he was initially called to. And the centurion says, this is not normal for a centurion to say this, right? This is totally counter opposite. Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. Only say the word and my servant will be healed. For I'm a man, and says, go, and he goes and comes. And then Jesus says at the end of those verses, when he heard this, he marveled. And then he says in Matthew, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, this enemy of yours, the centurion, many will come from east to west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Shocking to the Jewish people that a Gentile is sitting next to Abraham. So the centurion seals in living flesh the theme of the Sermon on the Mount. He is the living model and illustration of the sermon. Why is that? Because he shows compassion to his servants. Okay, he loves his slave. He loves the Jews who hated him. He built them a synagogue. He was generous enough. He built the synagogue, and he calls Jesus Lord. You are over me, even though I, in that world, am over you. And what did the centurion and the woman from Sidon have in common besides their great faith? Both of them amazed Jesus. Okay, two people in the Bible amazed Jesus. The centurion and the woman from Sidon whose daughter has a demon. And what did they have in common? This is to indict the Jews. They're both Gentiles. They have a sick loved one. They come to Jesus. They initiate it intentionally. They used analogies of their own life to explain their display of faith. The woman says, yes, Lord, but the dogs eat the crumbs. Great is your faith. The children, I don't want to give my bread to the dogs. It's for the children. Yes, Lord, but the dogs eat the crumbs. You know the analogy. So believe Jesus could heal and answer prayer. They believed it. That's why they came to him. Now, what are the names of two centurions in the Bible? Audience participation, Bible knowledge background. What are their two names? The guy we just talked about has no name. We don't know his name. So who are the two named centurions in the Bible? Don't know. Okay, that's okay. That's why we're here, right? All right. Cornelius. How many people have you met named Cornelius? How about Julius? I went to med school. One of my best friends was Julius, so we still have that name. Okay. All right. Now, what are the other centurions in the Bible and how are they depicted? Does anyone want to try that? When you hear a centurion, how do you see them in the Bible? Okay, usually yes. Well, I mean, they're going to obviously, right? But how are they? They're doing it internally. Hospital. Hospital. So some are hospital, and when they're in the hospital, some of them are not. Like the one that just presented, right? So let's look at that. Watch how they're presented. So a centurion in your mind is hostile against Jews, against Christ, and watch how they get portrayed. The servant who was sick, he was the model for Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. One was at the cross of Christ, hostile to Jesus, but then later on he says, this must be the Son of God. So that's positive, maybe he believed. Cornelius, of course, is praying, and Peter comes to him and gives him Christ, and he accepts. The centurion putting Paul to bind him to whip him with the superior office prefect, that was another interaction. 2 centurions taking Paul to Felix, protecting him from the crowd. A centurion took charge of Paul and gave him great indulgences. Felix let him have freedom. And then Julius took him to Rome and kept him from being killed and was very friendly toward him. So the centurion at the cross says, "This is the Son of God," after seeing all these things, so maybe he believes. And a centurion is very keen, accurate, he's observant, and then he observes this from his heart. Surely this man was the Son of God. He hears what was going on around him. The other one was the Cornelius, who the angel answers his prayer and says, "I'll send someone to you." And then Peter is praying, and then the angel says to him, or God says to him, "When the sheep come down from heaven with all the animal, rise, Peter, eat 3 times. Not so, Lord, I'm a Jew, I can't eat. Don't call what I call clean unclean." What kind of message is that? Well, knock, knock, knock on the door. Let's go see Cornelius. "Oh, you're a Gentile, you're unclean. I shouldn't call you unclean. The message needs to go to the Gentiles." So God is answering prayer, and he bows down to Peter, and Peter goes, get up, I'm just a man just like you." And then he gives him the gospel, and his whole family believes, right? That's in the book of Acts. He and his whole family were devout, God-fearing. They gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial before God. That smells good to me. Let's get a messenger to him and tell him the truth. That's how God works, right? And then we have the centurion says, "Let's question Paul to find out why this riot is here. We're going to scourge him and ask him a bunch of questions," right? And Peter says, "Can you bind a Roman uncondemned?" And then they stop what they're going to do, because he's a Roman centurion. So those are more centurions who were going to do something bad, but they were held back because of their belief in following the Roman law. And then when Paul was being beaten by the mob, the centurions let him speak and give a speech. And when they said the word "what," did the mob come at him and try to kill him, and they had to hurry him away. What word did Paul say that made the crowd who was listening to him speaking in Hebrew? They all listened with one word. Whole crowd. He says one word, and then riot. Let's get out of here. What was one word? Gentile. You say one word, that will get them going. Gentile. Let's have a riot. Okay, that's what he said. Okay, it's all in the book of Acts. All right. We see 2 centurions taking Paul to Felix and protecting him. So when Paul's nephew comes to the centurion and says, "By the way, I overheard they have 50 Jews said, I'm not going to eat until I kill Paul, and they're going to fast. And they want you to bring him over there so that they can jump out, kill him, and maybe kill some of your soldiers." And so they send him away with an armed guard of 100 horses with spears and 200 men. He gets them safely over there. Okay. And then the infamous shipwreck on the way to Rome, and the other Romans were going to kill everybody on board. But Julius says, "Don't kill them because I don't want you killing Paul." And so Julius keeps Paul from being killed, and Julius lets him have freedom to go back and forth because they know he's not going to run away. So there's another centurion who was very viewed positively. Who else did Jesus marvel at someone's faith? And we answered that, right? Then it was the woman of Sidon who came to him. And then who else was Jesus amazed and marveled at? This is a negative marveling, by the way. It says, when he came to his hometown of Nazareth, he preaches to them, and it says, he could do no mighty work there except he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, and he marveled because of their unbelief. I cannot believe that they don't believe what I'm saying. These are my hometown, these are my own folks. They haven't read the same Bible I read. I can't believe it. He went about the village circuit, and then of course they try to throw him off the hill, and he walks away from them. He's rejected by his own. Okay. And it says, many were amazed at his teaching, but did not believe in him. Okay. This guy has authority. He's saying things we haven't heard any of our teachers teach, but they don't believe in him. So when did people marvel at Jesus? It came to pass when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine. He taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. They were astonished, they marveled. When did the Pharisees marvel at Jesus' disciples? Here's a bunch of fishermen, and there's nothing exciting to marvel about or be amazed. So when did the Pharisees get marveled or astonished at the disciples? Peter, thank you. And watch what it says. When they saw the courage of Peter and John preaching, when they told them, don't do this or we're going to kill you. Okay, they didn't care, they kept doing it. They realized, watch this, they're unschooled. How are these people have no training whatsoever like us? They're ordinary men, these are nothing but fishermen. They were astonished and they took notes. This is the key. These men had been with Jesus. So Jesus, you want to walk with Jesus like that, then they'll marvel at you, right? Where's the honor and glory go? To you? No, you're ordinary. It's to him, right? Great truth. Now, let's jump into today's lesson. We have this story here that most people are aware of. The widow of Nain and her son, her only son, is coming to meet Jesus. They're leaving the city. He's coming from the country to the city. They're going to the country where the funeral burial will happen. So what is the message of Jesus resurrecting the son of widow of Nain? That is today's question. What is the message? Why include this in the gospel? Okay, that's the big question. All right, and then we know the story. This is what it looks like. Let's break it down and let's look at each component and we'll see something interesting here. So Luke 7:11 through 17, if you could read with me. Now it happened the day after, okay, the day after is when he was with the centurion, that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him in a large crowd. So here's Jesus, large crowd. He just finished with the centurion. He's in the next day. He comes near the gate of the city. Behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had what? This is the whole message. When he sees this, he goes, let me walk away from this. No, he goes, he had compassion on her. That is the point right there. If you came on the scene, what would you do? Register 10 out of 10 compassion or 1 out of 10? Walk by, right? He says to her, don't weep. That's a command. Now that's a strange command, isn't it? Your son just died, stop crying, because he's going to do something, right? So he comes and he touches, stop, open the coffin, and those who carried him stood still. This guy's talking with authority. I'm going to do what you say. He goes, young man, I say to you, arise. So he who was dead sits up and he began to speak. And Jesus presents the young man to the mother. Okay. Then what happened? Fear came upon all. They glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us. Who is the great prophet in the Old Testament? Moses says, I'm going to send a prophet like me who will tell you what to do. And when I send him, follow him. Who was the prophet Moses said? Jesus. A great prophet has visited his people. This report went about all Judea, the surrounding region. Okay. So if we think about this, the widow's son is coming to death, and Jesus releases freedom for the prisoners. And the most important lesson today is the compassion and power of Jesus is on display. Okay, don't cry and then rise up, right? And then they're all filled with awe. So let's dissect this real quick. What can we say about the widow and her future before Jesus? And we know a little bit about widows today, but what about widows back then? What was her future like? No son, you're all alone. How are you going to eat? Your life is over. It's gone. They're going to sell your house. You can't make a living. Your future is about as bleak as it could possibly be in that society. Okay? So, the woman lost her son. It's her only son. Her husband's already gone because she's a widow. She's weeping, sobbing, wailing. And Jesus says, stop weeping. Okay? So, that's the situation. Now, what's the contrast from Jesus' followers and the widow's followers? We have two crowds. What's in their minds? And how do they meet? Interesting question, right? Think about it. Two very different crowds converge at the right time at the gate. Death is coming out. Christ, I am the life, is coming towards me. Opposites. One is mourning. The other one's rejoicing because they just came off a big deal with the centurion. One's heading towards the city of Nain. One is heading towards the cemetery. We don't know why Jesus did that or going there, but he was on a divine appointment, and they both witnessed the glory of God. Both crowds saw the same thing. Now, what was the purpose of miracles performed by Jesus, the disciples, the prophets? What's the number one reason miracles are in the Bible? What would you say? The number one reason.
Yeah, to testify.
To demonstrate, to testify, to validate. To validate the message. So if you want to validate the message, you have a miracle and everybody's totally amazed. But still, some people saw that a miracle would make them believe, but many do believe. So you validate the message, right? The purpose of miracles was to corroborate the message being proclaimed. It, of course, benefits the recipient. However, the miracle in this time is very personal, very emotional, and what Jesus saw means to perceive, to know. Jesus didn't just see this woman, he saw her heart, her whole life. He knows all about her, okay? He has compassion with her. He enters into her pain and suffering, okay? Just like when he sees the pain and suffering in Lazarus, he starts crying because he's human. He enters it into there. He has compassion, not just empathy, pity. He felt it in his bowels, the deepest emotions. He knew what he was going to do. What was significant for Jesus speaking directly to the young man? Young man, arise. Why is that significant?
He has the word of life.
He has the word of life. What if he says, arise? What would happen maybe? Resurrection. But you see, it's personal. It's young man, you. I'm not saying everybody in the cemetery, you. Okay? So, Jesus touches the bear on which he's wrapped, and he says, young man, I say to you, arise, and then he raises him up. He restores him to complete health and strength. And we don't know what he said other than those words. And it's proof that he is able to do what he said he did, right? And remember when Jesus says, Lazarus, come forth. Why did he call his name Lazarus? Because if he says, come forward, who's coming? So, you see how personal it is? Lazarus, come forward. Now, when did someone not recognize Jesus until he called their name? Mary Magdalene, right? So when Jesus calls your name, do you hear him? Are you his sheep? Or does it go, I don't know, right? All right, here it is. Mary meets Jesus and doesn't recognize him. And Jesus says, woman, why are you crying? What are you looking for? Thinking he was a gardener. This is the gardener. Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've put him. I'll go get him. And then the next verse, Jesus says to her, Mary. She turns toward him and cries out, Rabboni, which means teacher. So when you hear the word Mary, a shepherd says your name, you recognize, right? Interesting. Now, what does Jesus presenting the son to her mother foreshadow for you and me and everybody else? Have you been to a funeral lately? Okay, so what does it foreshadow? Jesus gives the young man back to his mother. This shows us and reminds us there will be reunions after death. Christ will his own hands restore kindred to kindred at the glorious morning. So this is another example of what Jesus is going to do in the future, okay, for those who believe and are in heaven. So what is unique about the people that Jesus shows compassion? Every time you read in the Bible, Jesus shows compassion, Jesus shows compassion, Jesus shows compassion. What is the target of his compassion? Is it Nero? Is it the Pharisees? Is it Caiaphas? Who's he showing compassion to?
The ordinary person.
Ordinaries, but not just ordinaries. What else is about? Watch this. He had compassion for the blind. He has compassion for the untouchables, the tax collectors, the prostitutes. He has compassion for the demon-possessed, people you don't want to mess with. He has compassion for the grieving. He has compassion for the poor. That wasn't natural in that society. When you're in India, if you show compassion to someone who's an untouchable, why is that bad in the Hindu faith? Because they're paying their karma. They need to pay for their karma so they can move to a higher level. So therefore, you don't help them because they're getting their just dues so they can move on to a higher form. That's why untouchables exist in the world in that faith. Now they may not be as bad as they were in the past, but that was the opposite, right? So what was the result of Jesus raising the widow of Nain's son? What was the final result of all that? Fear comes upon all of them. If you were there, would you have this incredible all fear? The fear of God is given with you. Okay? Then what happens? They kept on glorifying God. So this results in what God is after all, glorifying God. And they concluded a prophet has risen among us. God has visited his people, and the fame goes around everywhere. Now, what's the difference between resuscitation versus resurrection? Anybody want to know?
You're not dead if you're resuscitated.
Right, right. Now, everybody in the Bible that was resuscitated died for so many years, right? They weren't forever living in eternity, right? So there was a little difference, but nevertheless, they were resurrected. How many people were resurrected in the Bible by Elijah? How many? One. How many were resurrected by Elisha? Two. Okay, Jesus, 2, Peter, 1, Paul, 1. So we got the widow of Zarephath by Elijah, the Shunammite son by Elisha, the man raised by Elisha's bones when they got buried. Many people at Jesus' death come out of the tomb. Jesus is raised for eternity, the ultimate resurrection. The son of the widow of Nain, Jairus' daughter, Jesus, Lazarus, so that's 3, I was wrong, perfect number, right? And then Tabitha and Eutychus, right? So Elijah raises the widow's son. That happens in Kings. The Shunammite woman, because she's so nice to Elisha and had no kids, what do you ask? And Elijah said, when I come back next year, because you take care of me, you'll have a son. She gets a son. The son's out in the field with the father. My head is hurting. Heat stroke, who knows? Go to your mother. Go to your mother. She dies. The mother runs and finds Elijah. Elijah says, hey, servant, go put my staff on the kid and see what happens. Nothing happens. And Elijah shows up and he is raised from the dead. And then when Elijah dies, they put his bones in the ground. And when the Midianites come into the area, for some reason, they're burying people in Elijah's grave. And the Midians are coming and they're trying to bury this guy who died. But because they got to hurry up, they don't have time to dig, they open up Elijah's coffin, not knowing. They throw the guy's body in there. The guy hits the bones of Elijah and he's resurrected. So, Elijah's bones touch this person and he's resurrected. Now, how many miracles did Elijah perform compared to Elijah, and why is that relevant? Thank you. Very good. What did she say? She said, "Dear God, Elijah goes to Elisha. What do you want from God?" Elisha says to Elijah, "I want a double portion of your spirit upon me." Elijah says, "What you want is very hard, but if you see me going into heaven with the chariots of fire, that means you got your request." So what happens? Immediately the chariot pulls up, Elijah goes up. Elijah looks at him and says, "What? The chariots of God are here." And then the robe leaves Elijah, falls from the earth, and Elijah now has his mantle, which means I'm a prophet. He got his wish. And how many miracles did he perform in the Bible? Whether you say he did 14 or 18, depending on how you define them, Elijah only has 7 or 8, and Elisha has twice the amount, including 2 people raised versus 1. Now, the resurrected saints in Jerusalem is an interesting concept. It says the tombs were open, many bodies of the saints who'd fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to men. So that's all you know about that. And then we have ultimately the supreme resurrection. And what was unique about Jesus' resurrection compared to all others? Okay, we just presented all these resurrections. What was unique about Jesus' resurrection?
Nobody was there.
What's that?
Nobody was there.
No one was there. Very good. Except Jesus, glorified body. If they all died, he doesn't, right? This is the ultimate resurrection, right? Well, of course, efficacy-wise, what does Elijah raising the son have to do with you today? Nothing. What does Jesus' resurrection have to do with you today? Everything. So obviously, the efficacy of the resurrection is totally different because he paid for your sins, and the proof that God the Father accepted Jesus' sacrifice is the resurrection. So when you see the resurrection, you see God the Father says, "Yes, I accept the sacrifice Jesus did on your account, paid for your sins. I approve he's resurrected." That's the proof of it, right? It's in the Bible. Jesus says to Martha, I am the resurrection. When you see me, you see the resurrection. He actually is his body, his person, who he is. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though he died. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then, of course, Jesus raises the widow's son. Jesus raises Jairus' daughter. Jesus raises Lazarus. Peter raises Tabitha or Dorcas. And Paul raises Eutychus, who falls asleep during the sermon, like some of you, right? Okay. Paul raises Eutychus, who falls asleep, falls 3 stories dead, and he raises him up. And that's, guess what? Don is going to come up and help us with this song, and Robert's going to come up and direct the audience. So please stand. And I hope we saw a little different light of Jesus' compassion, and this means people and feel the pain that they feel, so we can identify with them. In fact, 1 Corinthians says, comfort one another with the comfort you were comforted with. So there you have it. Okay, Jesus paid it all.